Chapter 17 Reformers and Self-Helpers. Not all the old comers were frightened. Some became reformers. If the whole country had troubles, they said, it was everybody's fault. If the country had too many strikes and too much crime, you could hardly blame those who had just arrived. It was mainly the fault, they said, of the Americans who had been here longest and who had had the most chance to make the country better, who had built the cities and constructed the slums where the poor had to live. Who were the congressmen, senators, and businessmen and policemen? Not recent immigrants, and it was not the immigrants' fault if the nation was not prepared to receive them. Jane Addams was one of the most remarkable of the reformers and one of the most original Americans of the age. Addams was born with a deformity of the spine. It made her so sickly that after graduating from college in 1882, she had to spend 2 years in bed. Her wealthy family sent her to the best schools and colleges. She traveled abroad whenever she wished. One day, when she was in Spain, she watched a bull fight. That evening, she said she was surprised and horrified to realize she had watched 5 bulls and many more horses get killed, and it hadn't even bothered her. She suddenly decided that she was wasting her life, and she had to change. The trouble with people like that, like her, Addams decided, was that they allowed themselves to be caught in the snare of preparation. To become leaders, they pursued long years of education, but traditional classroom book learning kept them on the sidelines at the very time when they were most anxious to rebuild the world. Addams concluded that she and her friends needed more education, but it was a type of education they could not find in books. In June 1888, she stopped in the poorest section of London to visit a group of Oxford and Cambridge graduates who lived in the famous Tony B. Hall. These people lived there in order to help the people of the neighborhood. Addams decided to start something like Tony B. Hall in the United States. Her plan was simple. She would settle a group of educated young men and women from well-to-do families in the poorest, most miserable city slum. Like Tony B. Hall, she would call it a settlement house. That's because the well-bred young men and women who would settle in the midst of the slum would be like the early colonial settlers. They would leave the comforts of the life with which they were familiar to live in a place as forbidding as the American wilderness had been to their forebears. Addams realized that the young men and women who came to live in the slum would see the struggles of the poor, and they would learn things from their experiences they could never learn from books. At the same time, the people of the slum would learn things from the settlers because they would use the settlement house as a school, a club, and a refuge. With her purpose clearly in mind, Addams acted quickly. Since she knew Chicago, she decided to do her work there. She looked for the neediest neighborhood, and she persuaded the owner of a large old house to let her have it free. She opened her settlement house between an undertaker's parlor and a saloon. She called it Hull House, after the man who had built it for his home years before. Newcomers from all over Europe lived in the neighborhood of Hull House: Italians, Germans, Bohemians, French and Canadians, Polish and Russian Jews, and more. Addams set up a kindergarten and a boys' club for the young, and she paid special attention to the very old people whom nobody else seemed to care about. Addams displayed red roses at a Hull House party. One old Italian woman was so delighted at the sight, she imagined Addams must have brought them all far away from Italy. She would not believe for an instant that they had been grown in America. Addams wrote, she said that she had lived in Chicago for 6 years and had never seen any roses, whereas in Italy she had seen them every summer in great profusion. During all that time, of course, the woman had lived within 10 blocks of a florist's window. She had not been more than a 5-cent car ride away from the public parks, but she had never dreamed of going forth for herself, and no one had taken her. Her conception of America had been the untidy street in which she had lived. Hull House launched all sorts of unexpected projects. Participants founded a book bindery and a music school. The amateur little theater movement staged its first plays at the Hull House, and the movement eventually spread across the country. Addams' work became famous, and settlement houses on the Hull House model soon appeared in big cities everywhere, and the formerly hopeless sons and daughters of poor families suddenly found their chance to become playwrights, actors, composers, and musicians. For the first time, many thousands of these immigrants discovered that somebody else cared about them. Jane Addams, without the aid of governments or politicians, had helped make America the promised land. America had always been a land of help yourself. Before long, some of the most energetic reformers came from the immigrants, but it was not easy for newcomers to become leaders. So many respectable institutions remained in the hands of the old comers, people whose families had been here for a century or more. For example, Harvard College was the oldest college in the country. It was where the young blue bloods had learned their ideas of Anglo-Saxon superiority, and old comers ran it. It was hard even to become a student there if you were not one of them. New institutions offered the best chance for newcomers. Among the most remarkable and most American of these institutions were the scores of new colleges and universities. There were only 17 state universities at the outbreak of the Civil War, but then, in 1862, an energetic congressman from Vermont, Justin Morrill, secured the passage of legislation that is known even today by his name, the Morrill Act. The Morrill Act granted lands from the public domain to support new state colleges. Each state would receive 30,000 acres for each of its senators and representatives in Congress. These would be called land grant colleges, and they would teach students how to be better farmers. After the Civil War, hundreds of other colleges and universities were also founded, and in the later years of the 1800s, some of the wealthiest go-getters gave millions of dollars to found still more institutions of higher learning. Johns Hopkins University was founded in 1876 based on a fortune left by a merchant from Baltimore. Leland Stanford, a railroad builder and former governor of California, founded Leland Stanford Junior University in 1885 in memory of his son. John D. Rockefeller, the go-getting oil millionaire, founded the University of Chicago in 1891. And these are just a few. There were scores of others. Many of these colleges' founders were men who themselves had never gone to college, but they shared the American faith in education. Even before the end of the century, the United States had more colleges and universities than there were in all of Western Europe, and more than could citizens in any other country. Americans could afford to go to college. The children of poor immigrants, along with millions of other Americans, now had a better chance to rise in the world. The new labor unions had become centers of new leadership of self-help. Samuel Gompers had been born in London. He came to New York as a boy. He worked at starvation wages as a cigar maker before becoming president of the Cigar Makers Union and then the first president of the American Federation of Labor. Sidney Hillman, who came from Lithuania when he was 20, led the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, the union that did most to help the new immigrants in big cities in sweatshops. In politics, the support of your fellow immigrants counted for something. Crowded together in the cities, the immigrants of any one nationality found it easy to stick together to support one of themselves. Soon, now, political leaders from among the newcomers themselves began livening up City Hall and even the halls of Congress, which began to sound like a United Nations. The representatives of Italian Americans and German Americans and of the new arrivals from everywhere gave a new spice to American politics. One of the most colorful of these newcomer politicians was Ferrelio LaGuardia. His mother and father had come from Italy. Ferrelio was born in New York City only 3 years after they arrived. His father, a musician, joined the army and soon became the leader of an infantry band. On an army post in Arizona in the 1880s, Ferrelio saw the pioneer West. He found it a paradise for a little boy who could ride burros. We could ride burros. Our playground was not measured in acres or city blocks, but in miles and miles. We could do just about anything a little boy dreams of. We talked with miners and Indians. We associated with soldiers, and we learned to shoot even when we were so small the gun had to be held for us by an elder. LaGuardia had his first glimpse of corruption while there. It was something he would never forget. Men who were being paid to supply the army with wholesome beef were supplying diseased beef instead, and they were pocketing the money. LaGuardia's father became so ill from eating diseased beef, that the army discharged him from the service, and a few years later he died. No wonder Ferrelio spent his life fighting corruption. For several years, LaGuardia worked at United States consulates in Eastern Europe. He learned about the problems of immigrants in their homelands. When he returned to New York in 1906, he joined the Immigration Service on Ellis Island. That was where the Immigration Service examined newcomers before admitting them to the United States. LaGuardia knew Croatian as well as German and Indian. While he worked as an interpreter, he learned the immigrants' troubles and the immigrants' hopes. In 1917, LaGuardia went to Congress, where he began his long, fearless career of defending the poor and of fighting corruption. He carried on his fight when he became a mayor of New York City in 1934. Now he thought of the city as his family, and all of the city's problems were his. His familiar figure, topped by the broad brimmed cowboy hat he had learned to wear out in Arizona, was soon bouncing all over the city. He especially liked to be on hand at trouble spots. Whenever there was a big fire, LaGuardia somehow arrived with the fire chief. LaGuardia served as mayor for 12 years. He did more in that time to remove the blot of the slum and to brighten big city life than any other New Yorker before him.